The early British colonies in America were deeply tied to the transatlantic slave trade, a tragic and inhumane system that forcibly brought millions of Africans to the New World. Enslaved people were subjected to brutal conditions, stripped of their freedom, and forced to labor on plantations, primarily in the southern colonies. This exploitation of human beings fueled the colonial economy, creating immense wealth for some, while dehumanizing and oppressing entire populations. The legacy of the slave trade had profound and lasting effects on the development of American society and its struggles with equality and justice. Of course, this little history lesson comes with a glaring asterisk: enslaved people in the southern colonies. By 1763, the brutal institution of slavery was deeply entrenched, and the laws were clear. Africans and their descendants were considered property, plain and simple. In fact, slavery in the British colonies, particularly in the South, could be harsher in certain ways than in other colonial regions, like the French Caribbean or Spanish-held territories. Let me explain. In the Catholic-influenced French and Spanish colonies, there was a slight chance that enslaved people could earn their freedom under certain conditions. You'd occasionally see slave owners free their slaves as a kind of reward for loyal service, often due to church pressure. In the British colonies, not so much. Freedom wasn't really on the table, and manumission, the act of freeing slaves, was looked down upon, so if you were born into slavery in the British colonies, chances were slim you'd ever know anything else. Running for freedom, the geography trap. Another bleak reality: it was much harder to escape slavery in the British colonies compared to, say, Brazil, where some enslaved people would run west into the Amazon and live out their days in freedom. The Appalachian Mountains and dense forests in North America made escape much riskier: fewer places to hide, fewer allies to help, and a higher chance of being caught. Plus, maroon communities, those settlements of escaped slaves, were far less common in North America. In places like the Caribbean and Latin America, there were occasional successful slave rebellions or large maroon communities. But that kind of resistance just didn't happen as often in the British colonies. So, if you were enslaved in the British colonies, chances of rebellion or escape were slim. But here's the grim silver lining: while freedom was rare, survival rates were a bit higher compared to enslaved people in the brutal sugar plantations of the Caribbean. There, the work was grueling, and tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever were rampant. Many slaves didn't survive to adulthood. In the British colonies, particularly in the tobacco and rice fields of the South, the climate wasn't quite as deadly, and enslaved people were often worked hard, but not to death. Why? Economics. It was expensive to import slaves from Africa, and owners wanted to protect their investment. So while the conditions were still harsh, and the idea of freedom was mostly a pipe dream, enslaved people in the British colonies generally lived longer than their counterparts in the sugar-producing regions. The economics of enslavement and the cost of labor. When it came to the economics of slavery in the British colonies, it was all about the bottom line. Transporting enslaved people from Africa to the Americas was a long, expensive journey. So once slaves were in the colonies, the last thing their owners wanted was to work them to death, because replacing them was costly. Unlike places like Brazil, where enslaved labor was often more expendable due to the closer proximity to Africa and therefore cheaper access, in North America, enslaved people were seen as a long-term investment. Not exactly a heartwarming thought, but in the twisted economics of the time, it meant that survival rates for enslaved people were generally higher in the British colonies. So, the grim reality: if you were born enslaved in British North America, your chances of gaining freedom were slim to none, but your chances of surviving into adulthood were slightly better than if you'd been enslaved in a sugar plantation in the Caribbean. Survival, yes, but freedom remained a distant dream.